The voice you hear in the historical texts and dusty biographies is often that of the powerful, the conqueror, the king who changed England forever. But listen closely, and you'll hear the muffled sounds beneath the pomp and ceremony, the shuffling of a broken body, the hushed gasps of courtiers, the chilling silence of a man utterly alone. This is the story of Henry VIII, not as a historical figure but as a living, breathing horror movie, a man whose legacy is written in pus paranoia and the rotting flesh of a body that betrayed its master. Most people think they know Henry VIII, the jolly larger-than-life king who couldn't keep a wife, the caricature of a gluttonous man with a temper. But the actual truth is so much more horrifying, so completely twisted, that historians have spent centuries trying to soften the edges of this monster's legacy. We're talking about a ruler whose paranoia was so extreme, he slept with loaded weapons, whose eating habits would make competitive eaters quit in disgust, and whose treatment of women went far beyond simple execution, into realms of psychological torture that would impress modern serial killers. Let's start with the most stomach-churning truth about Henry VIII. By the final decade of his life, he had become a living, breathing horror movie. We're not talking about someone who was just overweight or unhealthy. This man's body had transformed into something so grotesque that even medieval people who were used to disease and filth were physically sickened by his presence. Henry's transformation from the athletic young prince into this walking nightmare began around 1536, when he suffered a catastrophic jousting accident that changed everything. During a tournament at Greenwich Palace, Henry, clad in heavy armour, was thrown from his horse and crushed beneath it. For over 2 hours, he lay unconscious, a Prince of England clinically dead, in an era when medical understanding was primitive. The impact of the horse and armour on his head and legs was immense. When he finally regained consciousness, those closest to him noticed immediate personality changes. The relatively reasonable young king became increasingly paranoid, violent, and completely unpredictable. The charm and vigour that once defined him had been replaced by a brooding, explosive darkness. It was as if a switch had been flipped, turning the charismatic monarch into a terrifying stranger. But the physical changes were even more horrifying. The jousting accident left Henry with leg wounds that never properly healed. For an energetic king, a wound that festered was not just an inconvenience, it was a curse. And over the years, these wounds became festering, rotting ulcers that consumed more and more of his lower body. We're not talking about small cuts here. These were massive open sores that constantly oozed pus, blood, and decomposing flesh. The smell was so overwhelming that courtiers would literally gag when approaching the king. Contemporary accounts describe the stench as being detectable from several rooms away. Servants would hold perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces when forced to attend to Henry, and many would actually vomit from the smell alone. The king's own physicians were so disgusted by the condition of his legs that they would make excuses to avoid examining him, despite the fact that refusing to treat the king could be considered treason. To them, the sight of the open wounds, the bubbling skin, and the constant seepage was a genuine medical horror show. As Henry aged, his weight ballooned to astronomical proportions. By his final years, he weighed approximately 400 lbs, with a waist that measured an incredible 54 inches. To put this in perspective, that's larger than most people are tall. His face became so swollen with fat that his eyes were barely visible as tiny slits in his massive head. His neck disappeared entirely, creating the appearance of a giant balloon sitting on top of his shoulders. Henry's physical state was a direct visual representation of the monstrousness that had grown inside him. The king's mobility became so limited that he required specially constructed chairs with pulleys and wheels to move around his palaces. Teams of servants were assigned to operate these contraptions, essentially carrying the rotting monarch from room to room. But here's the truly revolting part. As they moved him, pieces of infected flesh would literally fall off his legs, leaving a trail of decomposing royal remains throughout the palace corridors. Palace servants were forced to follow behind Henry's mobile chair with cloths and buckets, cleaning up the chunks of rotting king that dropped as he moved. Imagine being a servant whose job description included royal flesh cleanup duty. These people were so traumatized by their work that many quit their positions despite the prestigious nature of serving the king directly. The psychological impact on those around Henry was devastating. Courtiers who had once competed for the honor of being in the king's presence now dreaded any summons to appear before him. The combination of his terrifying appearance, horrific smell, and completely unpredictable violent behavior turned royal court life into a living nightmare for everyone involved. They were all living on a psychological precipice, knowing that a single misstep, a moment of visible disgust, or an unintended glance could lead to their ruin. But Henry's physical deterioration was just the beginning of the horror story. The brain injury from his jousting accident had fundamentally altered his personality, transforming him from someone who could at least pretend to be civilized into a monster who seemed to take genuine pleasure in causing suffering. The man who had once written love letters and composed music became someone who would order executions for the smallest perceived slights, and who would force people to watch their loved ones die before killing them as well. Medical experts today believe Henry suffered from a combination of conditions that would have made his final years absolutely excruciating. Along with the obvious obesity and infected leg ulcers, he likely had Cushing's syndrome, which would explain his dramatic weight gain, mood swings, and the wounds that refused to heal. The syndrome caused by prolonged exposure to high levels of cortisol, a stress hormone, would have exacerbated his unpredictable behavior and further contributed to his body's breakdown. He may have also developed diabetes, which would have made the leg infections even more dangerous and painful, as high blood sugar impairs the body's ability to heal. The truly tragic irony is that Henry, who claimed divine right to rule and insisted that God had chosen him to be king, couldn't even control his own bodily functions by the end of his life. Royal attendants had to carry special portable toilets wherever Henry went because he could barely make it from room to room without having accidents. The man who executed people for showing him insufficient respect was literally falling apart in the most undignified ways possible, a grotesque mockery of the absolute power he believed he possessed. His body, once the symbol of his regal strength and virility, had become a prison of pain and humiliation, a crumbling temple that no amount of power could fix. Everyone knows the rhyme about Henry VIII's wives: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. But this simple summary doesn't even begin to capture the absolute psychological torture that these women endured. We're talking about a level of mental cruelty that goes far beyond physical execution. Henry didn't just kill his wives. He systematically destroyed their minds, first turning marriage to the King of England into the most terrifying experience a woman could endure. Let's start with Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, and arguably the one who suffered the longest psychological torment. Catherine wasn't just divorced. She was systematically isolated, humiliated, and driven to what many believe was an eventual poisoning death. She had been Queen of England for 24 years, a loyal wife and a devoted mother. She was a woman of deep faith and unshakable dignity, which only seemed to enrage Henry more as he sought to break her. When Henry decided he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn, he didn't simply ask Catherine for a divorce. Instead, he declared that their long and storied marriage had never been valid in the eyes of God, essentially calling Catherine a harlot who had been living in sin for over 2 decades. This wasn't just a legal maneuver. It was a public shaming on a national scale, aimed at dismantling her very identity and honor. He stripped her of her title and ordered everyone at court to refer to her only as the Dowager Princess of Wales, a painful reminder of her first short marriage to his older brother Arthur. But the cruelty went much deeper than public humiliation. Henry forbade Catherine from seeing their daughter Mary, using the child as a weapon against her mother. Imagine being told that you can't see your own daughter because your husband has decided your marriage never existed. For a woman whose entire world revolved around her faith and her child, this was a special kind of hell. Mary was moved from one royal household to another, with strict orders that her mother was not to be allowed to visit or even write to her. The pain of this separation was a constant gnawing agony. Catherine spent her final years essentially under house arrest, forbidden from using her royal title, cut off from friends and family, and constantly threatened with execution if she didn't agree to Henry's version of reality. The psychological warfare Henry waged against Catherine was calculated and relentless. He would send her gifts and kind messages one day, then threaten her with treason charges the next. He forced her to sign documents acknowledging that their marriage was invalid, then would change his mind and demand different documents. The constant uncertainty and fear literally drove Catherine to physical illness. She developed severe stomach problems that many historians believe were caused by chronic stress and possible poisoning attempts. She was a woman whose spirit was so broken that her body began to fail. When Catherine finally died in 1536, she was completely alone, except for a handful of loyal servants. Henry refused to attend her funeral and forbade their daughter Mary from visiting her mother's deathbed. Catherine's final letters to Henry, begging him to show mercy to their daughter and professing her continued love for him, were never answered. The man she had loved and served faithfully for over 2 decades couldn't even be bothered to acknowledge her death. Instead, he threw a party to celebrate the end of a long, inconvenient chapter in his life. Anne Boleyn's fate was even more horrific than Catherine's because Henry's treatment of her revealed his capacity for elaborate, sadistic planning. When Henry decided he wanted to be rid of Anne, he didn't just order her execution. He orchestrated an entire conspiracy designed to maximize her psychological suffering before her death. The very public and gruesome end of her reign was not a swift act of political necessity, but a meticulously planned act of personal vengeance. First, Henry had Anne's court musician Mark Smeaton tortured until he confessed to having an affair with the Queen. The confession extracted under duress was the first brick in the wall of lies that would condemn her. But Henry wasn't satisfied with just one confession. He arrested 4 other men, including Anne's own brother George, and forced them to confess to adultery with Anne as well. The psychological torture of watching innocent people, including her own flesh and blood, being destroyed because of their association with her, must have been unbearable for Anne. She knew these men were being sacrificed to make her own fall from grace seem legitimate. But Henry's cruelty reached its peak when he forced Anne to watch the executions of all 5 men who had allegedly slept with her. She had to stand there a helpless witness to her own undoing, knowing she would be next. She watched her brother and innocent friends die because of her husband's paranoid fantasies and his ruthless desire for a new wife. The sight of her brother's severed head being held up for the crowd was designed to break her mentally before her own execution. For Anne, the horror of their deaths was a slow burn agony, a preview of her own impending end. Even Anne's execution was turned into a psychological torture session. Henry originally scheduled her to be burned at the stake, the traditional punishment for adultery. But then, in a supposed act of mercy, he changed it to beheading. He imported a special executioner from France, supposedly, to ensure a clean death, but really to drag out Anne's psychological torment for additional days, while she waited for the specialist to arrive. The famed swordsman from Calais was a tool of psychological warfare, making Anne wait in a state of suspended terror, oscillating between hope and despair. Anne spent her final days in the Tower of London, alternating between hysteria and eerie calmness, sometimes laughing uncontrollably, and sometimes praying for hours. The psychological pressure of knowing she was about to die for crimes she hadn't committed, combined with the trauma of watching innocent men die because of her, had clearly pushed her to the edge of sanity. Her mind, once sharp and ambitious, had fractured under the weight of her husband's elaborate cruelty. On the morning of her execution, she walked with a strange dignity, a hollow shell of the woman she once was. Her final moments a testament to the fact that her husband had succeeded in breaking her completely. Jane Seymour, often called the lucky wife because she died of natural causes, actually reveals another aspect of Henry's cruelty. Jane died from complications following the birth of Henry's son Edward, but Henry's reaction to her death shows his complete inability to see his wives as human beings rather than breeding stock. Her life, even in death, was defined by her utility or lack thereof to his dynastic ambitions. Within days of Jane's death, Henry was already making plans for his next marriage. He waited exactly 9 days after Jane's funeral to start negotiating with potential new wives, seeing her as a successful but ultimately expendable vessel for the heir he craved. The tears he shed were not for her, but for the inconvenience her passing caused to his plans. But the most revealing detail about Henry's treatment of Jane is what happened during her labour. Jane was in labour for over 30 hours, clearly in extreme distress. But Henry's physicians were more concerned with saving the baby than the mother. There are accounts suggesting that Henry actually gave orders prioritising the child's life over Jane's, essentially treating his wife as a disposable vessel for producing an heir. For Henry, the lineage was everything, the woman was nothing. He had finally gotten his son, and in the calculus of royal power, Jane had served her purpose. She was a means to an end, and once that end was achieved, her survival became a secondary concern. Anne of Cleves might seem like another lucky wife because she survived, but her experience reveals Henry's capacity for psychological manipulation on a massive scale. When Henry, disgusted by her appearance, decided he didn't want to be married to Anne, he forced her to agree to an annulment by threatening her with execution if she refused. He essentially told her, "Agree to public humiliation, or face the fate of my previous wives." Anne was so terrified of Henry that she agreed to pretend their marriage had never happened, and actually thanked him for the privilege of not being murdered. The psychological pressure Henry put on Anne was incredible. He essentially gave her the choice between agreeing to be called a failed queen and a non-wife, or facing the same fate as Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. Anne chose survival, but the price was having to spend the rest of her life pretending that her marriage to the King of England had been a mistake that never really counted. She lived out her days as the King's beloved sister, a title that was a constant, polite reminder of her rejection and Henry's absolute power. Catherine Howard's story is perhaps the most disturbing because she was essentially a teenager when Henry married her, and his treatment of her reveals his capacity for destroying young minds. Catherine was maybe 19 or 20 when Henry, now a grotesquely obese man in his late 40s with rotting legs, decided to make her his fifth wife. The marriage itself was probably traumatic enough. Imagine being a young woman forced to share a bed with a man whose body was literally decomposing. He was a physically repulsive figure, a walking monument to decay and excess, and she was a young girl expected to be his passionate wife. When Henry discovered that Catherine had sexual relationships before their marriage, his reaction revealed the full extent of his psychological cruelty. He didn't just execute Catherine. He passed a law making it treason for anyone to marry the king without revealing their complete sexual history. Think about the incredible narcissism and pettiness required to change the entire legal system because you discovered your teenage wife wasn't a virgin. This wasn't just punishment. It was a societal edict born of wounded pride. But Henry's treatment of Catherine went beyond legal changes. He had her imprisoned in the Tower of London for months before her execution, during which time he would send her messages alternating between false hope and death threats. One day, he would hint that she might be pardoned if she confessed her sins. The next day, he would send detailed descriptions of how her execution would be carried out. The psychological torture was so severe that Catherine reportedly had multiple nervous breakdowns while imprisoned. Guards described her as alternating between periods of complete silence and fits of screaming that could be heard throughout the tower. When she was finally executed, witnesses noted that she appeared to have aged years in just the few months of her imprisonment. The stress had literally changed her physical appearance, a testament to the fact that her mind and spirit had been completely ravaged. Catherine Parr, the final wife who survived, actually came closer to execution than most people realize. Henry had actually signed the warrant for her arrest on charges of heresy. Catherine was an intelligent, devout Protestant who in her zeal had made the mistake of trying to discuss religious reform with a king who saw himself as the ultimate authority on all things spiritual or otherwise. But Catherine managed to save herself through an act of psychological manipulation that reveals just how terrifying it was to be married to Henry VIII. When Catherine learned about the arrest warrant, she went to Henry and convinced him that her religious discussions weren't attempts to teach him, but rather attempts to learn from his superior wisdom. This act of complete submission and ego-stroking was enough to save Catherine's life. But imagine the psychological strain of having to constantly monitor every word you spoke to your own husband, knowing that the wrong phrase could literally get you executed. Catherine lived in constant fear that Henry would change his mind about her, and she spent her entire marriage walking on eggshells around a man whose mood swings could be deadly. The most disturbing aspect of Henry's treatment of his wives is that none of them had any real options for escape. Divorce wasn't available to them. Running away would be considered treason, and fighting back would guarantee not just their own execution, but potentially the destruction of their entire families. These women were trapped in marriages with a man who grew more physically disgusting and psychologically dangerous with each passing year, with no hope of freedom, except through death. If you think modern competitive eating is extreme, wait until you hear about Henry VIII's daily food consumption. This man didn't just eat like a king, he ate like he was personally trying to consume the entire agricultural output of England. We're talking about eating habits so excessive, so completely insane, that they would be considered a form of mental illness by today's standards. This was not simple indulgence. It was a symptom of a deeper psychological breakdown. Henry consumed approximately 5,000 calories per day during his later years. That's more than double what an active adult male should eat, and remember, this guy could barely walk by the end of his life. He wasn't burning off a fraction of what he was consuming, leading to his grotesque physical state. But the sheer quantity wasn't even the most disturbing part of his eating habits. It was the ritualistic, almost religious way he approached food, combined with paranoid security measures that turned every meal into a bizarre theatrical performance. A typical dinner for Henry VIII included an entire roasted pig, multiple whole chickens, several different types of fish, mountains of bread, and enough wine to intoxicate a dozen men. His kitchen staff prepared over 800 different dishes every single day just for his household, with Henry personally sampling dozens of them. The royal kitchens employed over 200 people working around the clock to keep up with his appetite, more staff than many modern restaurants employ today. The scale of this operation was mind-boggling, a testament to the immense resources and manpower he commanded. But here's where Henry's eating habits crossed the line from gluttony into genuine mental illness. He believed that different foods had magical properties that could change his physical and mental abilities. Henry was convinced that eating swan would make him more graceful in movement, despite the fact that by this point he needed mechanical assistance just to stand up. He believed that consuming large amounts of deer meat would make him a better hunter, even though he was too obese to ride a horse or draw a bow. Most disturbing of all, Henry believed that oysters would enhance his sexual performance with his wives. So he would gorge himself on massive quantities of oysters before visiting his wife's chambers, apparently unaware that his grotesque physical appearance and horrific body odor were probably bigger obstacles to romance than any dietary deficiency. The rituals surrounding Henry's meals were absolutely insane. Every single piece of food that entered the king's mouth was first tasted by multiple servants to check for poison. But Henry's paranoia went far beyond normal security precautions. He required his food tasters to wait 30 minutes after eating before he would touch anything, just to make sure they didn't drop dead from delayed acting poison. This was a king whose mistrust was so profound he couldn't even trust a simple meal without a long drawn-out security ritual. Even that wasn't enough for Henry's paranoid mind. He also required that his meals be prepared in completely sealed kitchens with guards watching every step of the cooking process. The salt, the spices, even the water had to be tested by different people. A simple meal became a military operation involving dozens of people and hours of preparation. This wasn't just about safety, it was about control. Henry's dining experiences were basically theatrical performances where he ate in front of hundreds of courtiers. And the whole process could take up to 4 hours. Imagine sitting there watching this massive, rotting king slowly work his way through enough food to feed a small village, all while pretending this was perfectly normal royal behavior. Courtiers were required to watch and appear interested and impressed by Henry's appetite, even as the smell from his rotting legs made many of them nauseous. The psychological impact of these meal performances on the court was devastating. People were forced to smile and applaud while watching their king consume obscene amounts of food, knowing that showing any sign of disgust or disapproval could be interpreted as criticism of royal behavior, which was treason. The dinners became exercises in collective psychological torture, where everyone had to pretend they weren't witnessing something deeply disturbing. Henry's food paranoia reached absolutely ridiculous levels when he banned certain foods from his court. Not because they were unhealthy, but because he considered them beneath his royal status. Common people's food, like turnips, barley and peas, were literally illegal at the royal table, even though they probably would have been much better for his health than the mountains of meat and sugar he consumed daily. The irony is staggering. While Henry was gorging himself on enough food to feed dozens of people, much of England was dealing with food shortages and agricultural problems. The king's excessive consumption wasn't just personally destructive, it was literally taking food away from his subjects. The royal kitchens consumed enormous quantities of meat grain and other staples that could have fed hundreds of common families. Even more disturbing is how Henry's eating habits affected his decision-making as a ruler. Contemporary accounts describe him making important political and military decisions, while in the middle of massive eating binges, often while so intoxicated from wine that he could barely speak coherently. Treaties were signed, wars were declared, and people were sentenced to death by a king who was often too drunk and food drunk to understand what he was agreeing to. The most grotesque aspect of Henry's gluttony was how it interacted with his rotting body. The excessive eating made his health problems worse, which made him eat more to try to feel better, creating a vicious cycle that accelerated his physical decay. As his legs became more infected and painful, he would eat more to distract himself from the pain. As his mobility decreased, he ate more out of boredom and frustration. By his final years, Henry's eating habits had become so extreme that his servants were genuinely concerned he might eat himself to death during a single meal. There are accounts of Henry consuming so much food so quickly that he would become violently ill, vomiting up partially digested meals before immediately demanding more food. His stomach had apparently stretched to accommodate such enormous quantities that normal portions left him feeling empty and unsatisfied. The psychological aspects of Henry's eating were perhaps the most disturbing of all. Food had become his primary source of pleasure and control in a life where his body was betraying him and his mind was deteriorating. When everything else was falling apart, he could still command the preparation of elaborate feasts and force people to watch him consume them. Eating became a way for Henry to assert his power and demonstrate his royal status, even as his physical appearance made him look more like a monster than a king. The waste generated by Henry's eating habits was staggering. Leftover food from royal meals could have fed hundreds of people, but it was often thrown away or given to dogs rather than distributed to the poor. The king's gluttony wasn't just personally destructive, it was a symbol of the incredible inequality and waste that characterized his reign. Even Henry's physicians were afraid to tell him that his eating habits were killing him. Because criticizing the king's lifestyle could be considered treason, they were forced to watch their patient destroy himself with food, while being unable to provide the basic medical advice that might have saved his life. The very power that allowed Henry to eat whatever he wanted in whatever quantities he desired also ensured that no one could tell him he needed to stop. Henry VIII's paranoia wasn't just a personal quirk. It was an infectious disease that spread throughout his entire kingdom, turning England into a surveillance state that would make modern dictators envious. By his final years, Henry was so convinced that everyone was plotting against him that he transformed royal life into a psychological horror show where nobody knew who they could trust, and saying the wrong thing to the wrong person could literally get you executed. The atmosphere at court was one of constant suffocating dread. Let's start with Henry's sleeping arrangements, which reveal the depth of his mental illness. The king slept with loaded crossbows next to his bed and kept multiple daggers under his pillow. But that was just the beginning of his nighttime security theatre. Henry also had armed guards stationed inside his bedroom, watching him sleep all night. Think about the psychological state required to be so terrified of assassination that you can't even close your eyes without armed witnesses. The very presence of the guards meant to provide security must have also been a source of constant tension. But even having guards in his bedroom wasn't enough for Henry's paranoid mind. He also required that his guards be rotated every few hours because he was convinced that spending too much time alone with him would give them opportunities to plan his murder. The guards watching Henry's sleep were themselves watched by other guards, creating layers of surveillance that turned the royal bedchamber into something resembling a high-security prison. Trust was a concept that had no place in his final years. The palace itself became a fortress of paranoia under Henry's direction. He ordered the construction of secret passages throughout every building he lived in, not for romantic rendezvous or convenient travel, but so he could escape if assassins came for him. These passages were elaborate networks of hidden corridors and escape routes that allowed Henry to move through his own palaces without being seen by his own staff. He was a ghost in his own home, moving unseen and unheard, perpetually on the alert. Henry had peepholes installed in walls so he could spy on his own courtiers and listening devices hidden in meeting rooms to eavesdrop on private conversations. The technology was primitive by modern standards, but the psychological impact was devastating. People never knew when the king might be watching or listening, creating an atmosphere of constant surveillance and fear. A quiet conversation in a remote corner of the palace could be a death sentence if misconstrued. But here's where Henry's paranoia reached truly insane levels. He created an entire network of spies whose job was to spy on his other spies. He had informants watching his informants, creating this twisted web of surveillance where nobody knew who they could trust. Court life became a psychological nightmare, where everyone was potentially reporting on everyone else, and the wrong word to the wrong person could result in accusations of treason. A casual remark about the weather could be twisted into a treasonous plot against the crown. The most disturbing aspect of Henry's surveillance network was how it turned people against their own families. Children were encouraged to report on their parents. Spouses were rewarded for betraying each other, and servants were given incentives to inform on their masters. Henry had successfully created a society where personal relationships were secondary to loyalty to the crown, and where trust was literally dangerous. He had sown the seeds of suspicion so deeply that they poisoned the very fabric of English society. Henry's food paranoia reached levels that bordered on the absurd. Not only did he have multiple food tasters, but he required his meals to be prepared in completely sealed kitchens, with guards watching every step of the cooking process. Every ingredient had to be tested by different people, and the entire preparation process was monitored by security personnel, who were themselves monitored by other security personnel. The paranoid security measures around Henry's food were so extensive that preparing a simple meal became a military operation. The kitchen staff lived in constant fear that some contamination or mistake in the food would be blamed on them as an assassination attempt, leading to their execution. But Henry's paranoia wasn't limited to adults. He actually suspected his own children of plotting against him. He had spies watching Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth, his own daughters, because he was convinced they were planning to overthrow him. These were children, and he treated them like enemy agents in their own home. The psychological impact on Mary and Elizabeth of growing up knowing their father considered them potential threats was devastating and influenced their entire lives. The most grotesque aspect of Henry's paranoia was how it affected his relationships with his wives. Each marriage became an exercise in psychological warfare, where Henry would test his wife's loyalty through elaborate schemes and traps. He would have servants report fake conversations to see how his wife would react. Or he would pretend to be ill to see if she would show appropriate concern, or if she might be hoping for his death. Henry's paranoid testing of his wives often involved having them followed by spies who would report on their every conversation and activity. The women were essentially prisoners in their own marriages, unable to have private conversations or personal relationships without wondering if everything they said was being reported back to their increasingly unstable husband. The paranoia became so extreme that Henry started executing people for crimes they hadn't even committed yet. He would have someone killed because he dreamed they betrayed him, or because someone else suggested they might be disloyal in the future. The Tower of London was constantly filled with people whose only crime was existing near Henry, while he was in one of his paranoid episodes. One of the most disturbing examples of Henry's preemptive executions involved the Marquis of Exeter, who was executed primarily because Henry had a dream that the man was plotting against him. The Marquis had shown nothing but loyalty to Henry throughout his life, but the king's paranoid interpretation of a dream was enough to seal his fate.